Okay, this is going to be a weird sermon, and I'm just letting you know that ahead of time. I want you maybe to imagine yourself back in school, and at the last minute, Professor Steele has called in sick, and so they took his TA, and says, "Here, you give the lecture today." And so I'm giving a two-part talk, and it's about a very big subject. It's the future of Christianity. And to bring it home, we'll focus next week on also the future of this particular church. And what you're going to hear today is not a sermon, not rooted in a particular scripture, but it is an interpretation of how we've gotten here at this place. So I leave it up to you, as I always think that every sermon really should end with these words. You judge for yourself if these things are so. There are natural moments of conversion in life, moments that change your life, moments that absolutely, completely transform you. You're one way, one day, and the next day you are different. And the world changes in that difference. Easter was like that for the disciples, fearful and in utter despair on Friday. But by Monday, they were rejoicing and were emboldened and ready to greet an entirely new creation. The world was brand new to them again. Whenever life unexpectedly springs forth from death, everything changes. Do you remember your first kiss? In my life, that was an earthquake. All of these emotions I had not really felt or known before blew up in my life, and my boyhood began to fade away. Something happened that day, and I was never the same. Similarly, I hate to make this analogy, but I am a boy. Similarly, the first time I was able to take the car on my own was a brand new world for me. It was an American rite of passage. I remember how grown up I had arrived. I was cool. I was somebody. And something in me that day, when I arrived back home safely, changed forever. Again, my boyhood faded away. One day I was one thing, and the next day I was something else. Conversions change us. They change our attitudes and our actions and our perspectives, our way of life. Conversions change our understanding of what is true, of reality itself. Conversions get us unstuck. They evolve us. They advance us. They push us out of the nest, so to speak. And although I've been using some rather silly examples of my own life and the individual conversions I've experienced, there are also examples throughout history of entire societies shifting their consciousness, their values, and their attitudes and their actions. I want you to think of human evolution. About 2 million, think of that, 2 million years ago, the human primate began to walk upright on 2 legs. And they invented tools. And they began to control fire. Imagine all of the conversions that took place along the way of the evolving of humanity. About 150,000 years ago, we took a great leap with the advent of language. We learned to talk. Imagine that. Imagine all those years. And then we learned to talk. If you've raised children, you can imagine that. The revolution, the change that happens. It was only 10,000 years ago, that we gave up being hunter hunter-gatherer clans. We began to settle in agricultural settlements. And with every one of those changes came conversions of consciousness and of an understanding of what our meaning and purpose is in this very mysterious world. From settlements came more and more increasingly complex ways of organizing human life. Villages became cities, which became kingdoms, which became states, which became empires. Imagine all of the changes as culture evolved and humanity came into greater and more complex understandings of itself and the world. For centuries, there had been an underlying stability to all of these changes. Humans were dependent upon and rooted to the land, living in extended families and clans and tribes, all of which were small and manageable and relational. It's like, small town America from America's past. You knew everybody. The world, though, was also infused with and inhabited by spirits. And these spirits required cooperation and appeasement and accommodation. Around 3,000 years ago, this stable world of sacred presence began to unravel and to lose its ability to give meaning and structure to the growing complexity of how humans could live together, how we could get along. A time of horrendous violence. Think of what you know of what has happened in Ukraine with the deliberate slaughter of civilians. That kind of violence erupted into unrestrained, lawless suffering and pillaging, terrorizing and warlording increased, bringing life itself into an unmanageable, savage war of each against all. And it wasn't just an individual war. It wasn't Russia invading Ukraine. This was happening throughout the world, everywhere, all the time, for hundreds of years. Imagine that. As humanity tried to come to grips with this tyranny of violence, a period of incredible creativity burst into human consciousness. And it gave birth to the great philosophical and religious systems that have shaped our perception of reality ever since. Simultaneously, over a few hundred years, simultaneously throughout the entirety of the known world at that time, consciousness shifted. And it gave rise to the ancient Greek philosophers, the great traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism. The Hebrew prophets emerged in those days, as did the Persian Zoroastrianism, Confucius, Taoism. All of this was happening in the same time period. Humanity went through a stunning conversion and came of age in a great cultural, psychological, spiritual leap of imagination. Everything changed. This burst of creativity we now know as the axial age, an axis. It created bumper cars, if you will, that helped bring law and order, a common good, and a common sense to what had become a chaotic, anarchic life of cruel domination of the strong over the weak. The emergence of new spiritualities and new religions created new avenues that began to temper and to tame our human tendency to be a predator species. And that old world, with its enchanted canopy of sacred presence, became implausible and incoherent. It was unable to tame the violent insatiability of human desire. But with the emergence of the religions and worldviews of the axial age, new myths, new sacred stories, new ways of being human in the world began to shape the consciousness giving us a new common sense. The old ways of small-scale hunter-gatherers died off. The old ways of extended families and clans settling around farming communities began to compete with the ever more complex organization of city and industrial living. A relational world where you knew everybody became a mediated world in which you knew people through institutions. Everything changed and as to what it means to be a human being. Old moralities that held clans and tribes together could no longer hold the complexities of cities and states and institutions and empires together. Old traditions and old gods faded away. And as the old gods of a spirit world died, the new gods of an axial age were born. I'm walking through this very, very broad brush of history to make a larger point. We are today living in what some would call an apocalyptic age. That means it's an age of endings. An age where the seams of our clothes, so to speak, have split wide open, and we're walking around in shambles and in disarray, more as beggars than as purposeful citizens. We live in a tippy-toe time. Will Putin launch a nuclear war? Will the next COVID become even more lethal? Will climate change unleash patterns utterly destructive for human habitation? Will immigration from the south flood the north, creating wars and chaos and anarchy? Will the 1% unleash technological totalitarianism over human striving? Our existential questions are complex and terrifying, and they overwhelm our ability to trust each other, to listen to each other, to care about each other. Like the addicted, we keep distracting ourselves from our fears and our worries and our wounds through the narcoticizing comfort of entertainments and amusements, hoping we can get out before the dam breaks and sweeps the whole civilization away. The world that we have created is no longer working for us as a collective body. It's no longer working for us as a habitat that will sustain us. We need a conversion of body and mind and soul. And as Christians, we need a conversion that speaks to the complexity rather than a perceived simplicity of life. We need a new axial age of creative reintegration if our grandchildren and 7 generations hence are going to inherit a livable world. For example, within the church, we keep treating our technologically digital kids as if they still live in a pre-electronic world of the great-grandparents. Despite the reality of evolution that reveals the 14 billion-year-old universe and the notion that humanity has been evolving on this earth for a couple million years, we're still teaching spiritual lessons that conceive of Adam and Eve, of Babel's Tower, of Noah's Ark, as if it were facts of history. We still project God as a super being who comes to our rescue, who will give us front row parking space if we just pray for it. We keep portraying God as an object of transactions. I'll give you this if you give me that. Or a genie who grants our wishes. But this God and these stories make no sense to our children. God has become no more meaningful than Santa Claus. And the sacred stories are little more than simplistic moralisms that don't work in their real, everyday, complex lives. And as soon as they are able, they flee the church. Not because they don't love us, but mostly because they're bored. And that's not because they're spoiled. It's because they're not challenged. They don't feel anything of importance is at stake. The world of the axial age reshaped how we understood God and ourselves, how we understood our meaning and purpose, our identity, and our morality, what's right, what's wrong. But the axial age itself has been deteriorating for quite some time, which began way back when Methodism, by the way, came of age. Back in the 1700s, this movement called the Enlightenment. Up until the Enlightenment, that which we would now label superstitious or supernatural, those were the primary drivers of authority and legitimacy and meaning in life. It was the gods. It was omens. It was movements in the stars, visions and dreams. It was the priests and religious institutions. It was the sheer dominating power of the strong over the weak that established and maintained authority and legitimacy and right and wrong. What the Enlightenment did, what happened in the 1700s, was the Enlightenment began to advocate truly revolutionary and just incredibly wacky ideas, like constitutional government of the people, by the people, for the people. It advocated for liberty, for tolerance, for the possibility of innovative progress. In other words, we are not victims of fate. It advocated for a separation of powers like church and state, separation between the judicial and the legislative and the judicial branches of government. It advocated for the creation of a secular state that was not dependent on the dogma of a theocracy. Revolutionary. One could even say that the Enlightenment created history, an awareness of pattern in history, because oral myth and story became written, immovable fact. Fact replaced myth as our primary form of consciousness, adjudicating what is true from what is false. We no longer looked to sacred story or even our own intuition. We looked to science and technology and the most effective technique that would empower us to achieve independence and autonomy. Fact replaced myth as the marker and maker of meaning. The Enlightenment utterly and completely revolutionized, converted the world. Now, as citizens today, we live our daily lives under an enlightened consciousness. All of us do. But as Christians, we all too often live our church life as if we're still in the axial age. But neither enlightened or axial consciousness can help us through the complicated maze of living in a world of 8 billion people. 8 billion people and an increasingly exhausted habitat. The prophet Greta Thunberg spoke truth. Our house is on fire. But the systems of a technological way of life do not know how to put the fire out. The apocalyptic narrative that the world is ending is, I think, correct. Our way of life is ending. The axial age and the world shaped by the Enlightenment, the only world any of us have ever known, that world is ending. An example is our bewilderment concerning the cultural war that divides red from blue, not just here, but throughout the world. It's the Enlightenment itself that is today under assault and is being shredded by illiberal movements such as the January 6th version of Christian nationalism, the subversion and dismantling of democracy in Hungary, in India, in Brazil, the reactionary cultural war led by the Republican Party, the crusade of Russia to resurrect a completely fabricated past empire. One could also make the case that critical race theory, cancel culture, and the rise of a liberal Puritanism, all of these are an example of an emptied, exhausted Enlightenment quest that has failed to provide us with meaning and purpose, because we are a species that cannot live without a coherent sacred story that offers hope for the future, healing from the past, and guidance in the present. The world is on fire, but the Enlightenment has gone dark. In Psalm 29, God, the psalmist, locates God inside the storms of life. The psalmist uses that poem as a way of affirming that even when suffering and sorrow are all around you, even when you're feeling small and powerless, even when all your religious chants and rituals fail to achieve a successful resolution, even when your world is ending, nevertheless, the power and presence of a God who has no image, whose name itself is a mystery, who is both present and absent at the same time, who is not in the world as a being, but animates all of being. This God, this sacred power that even suffering and sorrow are dependent upon, this God of the storm, this God in the storm, this God is with us and knows us by name. And when we are with this God, we experience peace. And that's where I'm going to leave this. Next week, I want to move into the part two, the point of my sermon. I want to focus this on an event that happened on December 24th, 1968. This event changed the consciousness of the world. It signaled the end of the Enlightenment, even as the Enlightenment signaled the end of the axial age. But more importantly, this event prophetically revealed where we must go from here if Christianity is to have a future. Or in other words, if 7 generations from now, if you dare to think that long, if 7 generations from now will bless or curse our name. Not an amen, but a to be continued.